Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Smith, the Senior Manager of Membership and Program Services here at ProLiteracy, which you'll hear more about shortly. I will be moderating our discussion today with our guests from ProLiteracy and the Australian Council for Adult Literacy. Guests, please introduce yourselves, starting with your name and title, and then the organization you represent. Joe, you can go first.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Jo Medlin and I'm in Australia. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Duckinjung people in Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I am the president of the Australian Council for Adult Literacy.
Thank you, Joe. Terrific. Todd?
And I'm Todd Evans. I'm the Director of Professional Development for ProLiteracy. ProLiteracy is headquartered in Syracuse, New York, but I work remotely here in St. Louis, Missouri.
Terrific. Thank you. So let's jump right into our discussion. Thank you again for both being here. I'm going to have each of you start. I'll have you go first on this one, Todd, since you sort of started to speak to it. If you would give a brief description of the organization, speak to sort of operational capacity, if you have an office, where it's located, scope of reach, and then talk about your mission, what that mission is, and how it translates into action. And after Todd goes, we'll hear from you, Joe. Okay.
Sure. So we're an organization of about 40 to 45 staff people, depending upon if we're fully staffed, not quite fully staffed, or if we've hired some folks to work on various grant projects that we have responsibility for. As I said, our office is in Syracuse, New York. About half of our staff work out of that office. The other staff work remotely around the United States. For our work in the U.S., we have over 1,000 member organizations, which we serve, partner with. We support them in a variety of ways, but we also work with kind of the larger field of adult education providers as well. And then we have over internationally, we work in about 27 countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. In our international work, we typically partner with a local organization in that country or in that community that we're working in. That might be a health organization, a human rights or development agency, or a community library. And what we do is we provide development support, technical assistance to them as they integrate literacy services in whatever issue or project that they are working on. Let's see, our mission. So our mission formally is changing lives and communities through the power of adult literacy. And just kind of what that looks like or what that means, I'll tell kind of two really quick stories. One is from my own experience in working in a local literacy organization in Memphis, Tennessee, before I came to work for ProLiteracy. There was a gentleman who was a student there, a young African-American man, and he had dropped out of high school. He had been throughout high school very frustrated, very angry, and had kind of continued to be that way as an adult because he knew that he was smart. He had a lot of ambition and was just frustrated in school because he wasn't successful, wasn't learning, and wasn't kind of getting the support that he needed. After several kind of attempts of driving by the literacy program, going up to the door, finally going in and signing up for classes, he found out that he had a learning disability, issues with his short-term memory, started working with taking classes at the Memphis Literacy Council, and learned how to read and learn how to accommodate and compensate for the learning disability that he had. And it really changed his life around. He had been working as a cook at a restaurant. He got promoted to being the kind of head chef in that restaurant. He had always wanted to paint, so he started reading books on painting. When I left Memphis, he was a well-known artist in the area, had several showings in art galleries. He wrote poetry. He published a poetry book. And just when you think about kind of how empowering it was for him to learn to read, I think that's a good example of kind of that empowering impact of adult literacy on somebody's life, and not just related to kind of a better income or things like that, but just being able to get to where they want to be and kind of how they see themselves. Uh, Another example real quickly is in part of our work, we've done work with domestic violence shelters in Florida. And one of the things that we realized there is they're providing a lot of educational services for the survivors in their programs. A lot of it was around financial literacy, financial empowerment, but the resources that they were using were written at a eighth, ninth, 10th grade level and really inaccessible for a lot of the clients, a lot of the survivors that they had trying to take advantage of them. So we partnered with those organizations to help them understand better the how many people in their, that were trying to get their services had literacy or English language issues and were preventing them from taking advantage of their services. We helped them develop some literacy services, and through that work, we're able to impact a lot of the survivors, both in their ability to kind of get their finances on track, but also just to recognize the value of education in terms of getting out of their domestic violence situation, and again, kind of getting to where they wanted to be. And a lot of those survivors transitioned from those smaller programs in the domestic violence shelters to enrolling in adult education programs, community colleges, going on to getting degrees, certifications, and things like that. So kind of once somebody gets on that path and really sees the impact that adult education can have on their life, it becomes a pathway to lifelong learning. So
Great. Thanks, Todd. Joe, can you tell us about an Australian Council for Adult Literacy, ACAL, or how do you say the acronym?
ACAL.
ACAL. Sorry. So ACAL, if you would, please.
Sure. So we're smaller in personnel, definitely, than ProLiteracy. We have a volunteer committee and we have about 14 members on it, and we meet formally once a month online, and we're funded only by membership. So we have members all over Australia, teachers, organisations that are delivering literacy, other stakeholders, that have an interest in it. And we have only one paid employee, and that's our admin officer, who just does a couple of hours a week to help us with, our web presence and things like that. So we have, in Australia, we have the ACAL, which is the peak body, and then each state has a literacy council, and we have somebody from each of those literacy councils on our committee so that we get really good representation and know what's going on. We can kind of have visibility across the whole country and see all the differences, of things that are happening. Our aim is to provide leadership in debate on adult literacy and to build an understanding about the issue. And we really focus our activity on advocacy. So we advocate for people who have literacy needs and need, to get to a class or need help in the workplace. And we also advocate for the workforce and people who are volunteering in the field as well. And we do a lot of networking and bringing people together. And we do that because we're a volunteer body. We do that by hosting conferences, by webinars like this one, providing people with lots of opportunities for professional development. We have a monthly newsletter that we try and bring all sorts of information into that, from some academic readings people could look at to what's happening, with government funded programs, examples of things that are happening that other people might like to try. And we sit on a number of committees. So as the president, I sit on some committees that the government run and give advice. I sit on some other committees, for different states and different organisations. So we mostly are trying to advocate. And the stories, Todd, that you've just told about those learners really resonate with me, because it's a similar thing, and it's what makes you really passionate about this. And I guess being a volunteer body, we're very passionate about this, because it's a lot of time.
Well, I was to say, you
to
need
put
to
in.
be. If you're volunteering, you
Yep.
need to be.
And
Not
we're
that
all working as
it-
well. So
even if you're being paid, it helps to be passionate in this field, because it's certainly not overwhelmingly funded. But I already see some similarities between the organizations. Well, certainly Todd and I are paid staff here at ProLiteracy. Your regional groups were not quite that structured, but we have member programs, and they're from all over the country. And as you know, we just launched an international membership. So now we're trying to get international members. And that's part of this sort of learning experience about different programs. And we send a newsletter, and we try to include information that our members would find useful. But I think we'll get into more of that a little bit, talking about advocacy versus what role we play. Joe, if you wouldn't mind speaking to, I think you already kind of touched on it, but if you have anything more to add about how you benefit adult learners and the community, I think you talked about it a little already. It sounds like it's a lot of advocacy. Is there anything more you want to share on that before I get Todd to address that question?
I think probably I think our main benefit comes through the advocacy work. We talk a lot to governments. We have little subcommittees happening, that are focusing on particular areas and talking to all the levels of government there. But really, one of the things that we're really focused on is trying to raise awareness in the community, because there's not a good understanding. There's a lot of myths and stereotypes around adult literacy. And so we spend a lot of time trying to break down those myths and address those. And we've done those through ongoing work in a number of different ways of reaching out to different organisations, going and talking to people. We've been involved in a television show. So there's all sorts of ways that we're trying to educate the general community, I guess, to say that, people with adult literacy issues, it could be the person next to you and you wouldn't know, because people hide it because there's such a stigma around it. And it's not just people who have a disability or are unemployed or are, working in low level. So we spend a lot of time just trying to raise awareness.
Sadly, I think that's a universal truth, because I think you could say that's certainly true in the United States. There is a lack of awareness. People are shocked when they hear the numbers. And I think they don't fully appreciate the stigma that prevents people from getting help. Before I pass to Todd, can you just expand a little on your advocacy with the government? Is that about specific legislation? Is it about funding? And we're going to talk about funding later, so I might be getting ahead of myself, but I'm curious if you could speak to that.
Well, we don't have a national policy at the moment in Australia on adult literacy. So our advocacy to Commonwealth government is very much around, it's great that you're doing the programs that you're doing, and I might talk about those a little bit later in more detail, but there are gaps, and the gaps aren't being. So we're constantly trying to remind them that there's more that needs to be done. I'm not sure where your data comes from in America, but we rely very heavily on PAC, the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, and Australia wasn't going to participate in that. Saw no reason to, or didn't want to spend the money, who knows why. And so we've done a lot of, advocacy to government saying we have to have some sort of data, because that's what you want. So, we do things like that. We kind of find that there's going to be a gap somewhere, and we're the voice for that. Because I suppose the thing about this field, isn't it, is that the people themselves who have adult literacy issues are not marching on the streets. They're not the squeaky wheel. Right. And so you need bodies of people who know something about them and who can advocate to raise awareness. And so that's really what we do with government, is to try and keep it on the agenda, to remind them that they need to do something about it. We would like a policy, or we've got a national framework at the moment that's in a draft. So we'd like government really to take notice of this. And what we often find is that when we talk to government, we're always funneled into one department, which is education and employment. And we're trying to constantly say, actually, the Minister of Finance should be interested in this, and the Minister of Health should be interested in this. Literacy underpins everything, but the government has a very narrow focus that this is only about education and employment. So that's a sort of advocacy that we do. We're really trying to educate the government as well about how important this is and what it could mean to them to invest in it.
Well, certainly the fact that they weren't going to do the PIAC, which we also use that data. So good for you that you convinced them to do that. And I'm going to have Todd tackle this now. And I'm already seeing similarities. So we're not as far apart as maybe we think. If Todd, if you want to talk about what do we do to benefit pro literacy, to benefit adult learners and benefit the community? What's our role, and, what is pro literacy's role? Is it advocacy? Is it teaching methodology? Have
Sure,
at it.
sure. And I'll start I'll start with the advocacy, since Joe, you were already talking about that. Our role is very similar in terms of advocacy. We are advocating to our federal government for legislation and for funding. The funding that gets put towards adult education as opposed to our K through 12 system is, minuscule in comparison. And yeah, so we're doing that. A lot of times we're doing that partnering with other national adult education organizations, the American Library Association. There is a National Center for Literacy that focuses specifically on advocating for legislation, and all of us who are kind of associated with adult educations are members of that organization. We've also used the PIAC data and have produced an advocacy toolkit showing our local programs how to use that data to advocate on a state and local community level for funding and for just recognition and support services. Part of what you were talking about, because adults have other things going on in their lives, they have other responsibilities. It's not necessarily just about funding education. That's great, but it's also about childcare services, having good public transportation so they can get to the classes that they need to get to, things like that. Having, we found out during the pandemic, it's having access to computers and technologies and Wi-Fi hotspots and those sorts of things that folks really need. So it's advocating for those sort of support services as well. We support, I talked about our member organizations. So we have over 1,000 member organizations here in the United States. We provide them with Michelle said, a newsletter, various discounts. Mostly what we provide them with is technical assistance. We talk to a lot of people. They pick up the phone and ask us anywhere from, we've got a new population of immigrants from Afghanistan, from the Ukraine coming in. How can we start a English language program to help serve those folks? How can we start a literacy organization? What approaches to instruction? How can we had a major funder that has disappeared in our community, and so we need to replace them. We're trying to start we have a business that's come into our community, and we need to start training people, preparing people to go and work for them so they can have better paying jobs. How can we set that up? So a lot of that support is just technical assistance, good old fashioned talking on the phone with people and sharing ideas. We provide a lot of professional development for the folks that run the literacy programs at the local level, and the folks that do the instruction. A lot of that is through our website, ProLiteracy Education Network. A lot of it is, we have a research journal, Adult Literacy Education, and we provide a lot of webinars, like it sounds like you did during the pandemic. We talk about very few of our programs did distance education. So when the pandemic hit, they all had to convert to a virtual environment in a period of about 3 weeks. And it was really a phenomenal effort. And we wound up just providing webinars almost every week for folks, helping them to understand what resources were available, how to teach virtually, um, find instructional materials, things like that. And then lastly, we do have a publishing division, New Readers Press, that publishes over 400 just instructional materials for adult literacy, our high school education programs, helping people get their high school diploma, English as English language learners, workplace literacy, financial literacy, health literacy, things like that.
Thank you, Todd. If you had to do a percentage, what percentage would you say we devote to advocacy versus general support to the field and the people who are doing direct service in terms of that professional development and resources?
Oh, I would say probably maybe 2/3 of what we do is professional development, and the other third is advocacy work.
Okay. Thank you.
And a lot of times it's combined. When we're looking to provide professional development, we require a grant of some kind to do that. So there's a lot of advocacy on the front end in terms of educating foundations and businesses and helping them understand the need and the connection, as you said, Joe, to other issues like, health and things like that. And then transitioning that into professional development and other resources.
That's actually a nice segue into our next question. I'm going to have you continue, Todd, because you already touched on it, and then I'm going to bring in Joe. How is adult literacy education supported in your country? So we're looking at funding. Is it from the government? Is it from other sources? In general, for the field, but also particularly for your organization, your funding. And again, we're covering some same ground here again, but I think it's good to talk about. And in terms of the programs, who is doing that work and delivering those services? So Todd, you started to talk about corporations, which I think is part of this. So if you want to expand.
Sure. So in terms of our organization, about 80% of our funding comes from sale of from our publishing division, New Readers Press, sales of those materials. The other 20% comes from various grants that we apply for and individual contributions and donations. And then a lot of those grants, they either go to developing resources for the field or they're straight kind of pass through funding. We have several grant projects where we help people buy books, we help people buy digital products, we provide them with just general operating grants that they can use to pay for internet services within their organization, buy computers, things like that. Those are our National Book Fund, our Mobile Learning Fund, our Write Her Future, which is a grant from Lancome that again kind of provides materials to programs that focus specifically on serving women, and then our Literacy Opportunity Fund, which is just operational grants for local programs funded by the Nora Roberts Foundation. In general, adult education in the United States, the U.S. government and state governments provide a lot of that funding to specific. There's kind of two categories of, or I should say, three categories of organizations that provide adult education services throughout the U.S. Probably the biggest part of them are what we would call kind of our state-funded school systems. That might, in any state, it runs differently, but it might be funded through the K-12 system, through the libraries, through the community colleges, or things like that. But those are folks that get funding from the federal government. It passes into the states. The states have to match it, and that goes down into those particular systems. And those are typically professional teachers, full-time or part-time. They're kind of classroom oriented, large classroom uh, uh, oriented towards instruction. A lot of times they focus on GED or high school, getting your high school diploma. They might integrate workplace literacy, things like that. A second group is kind of other funded agencies, funded from some other entity. So those are your correctional facilities and your libraries are probably the two biggest ones. And then the third is community-based organizations. And those are, when I talk about our 1,000-member programs, the majority of those are community-based organizations. They're community-based nonprofits. They may get their funding from a variety of sources, individual contributions, fundraising events, grants from the United Way or an organization like that that kind of does community-based grants for nonprofit organizations addressing a variety of issues within a community. Um, and their focus is really on serving those folks that don't fit into those other areas. So they might be immigrant and refugee programs. They might be just working with adults who kind of aren't at that high school diploma level, at a lower level, or who aren't, you know, I'm thinking about folks in the program that I worked with in Memphis. You know, a lot of them were trying to get their high school diploma, trying to get a job, but a lot of them were older.
Mm-hmm.
They were retired. They're not looking for a job. They're not looking to get their diploma. They just need to read, to be able to read to their grandkids, to
Mm-hmm.
read their mail, to balance their checkbook. You know, a lot of them were, you know, kind of widowed. Their spouse had, you
Mm.
know, handled their books and things like that. And they're at a point where they just need kind of help doing some basic literacy things that aren't tied to those larger kind of goals that that government entities like to measure, employment and high school diplomas and things like that.
Can you
Um,
comment briefly on WIOA funding? I don't know if you were going to address that. It may be a unique thing that I don't might be interesting. I don't know if there's an equivalent in Australia, but just briefly.
Sure. So I think I'm not going to remember this because it's transitioned from WIA to WIOA, and I think WIOA stands for Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. I might be ex wrong on exactly what that is, but it's WIOA. So that's typically where the funding comes from, and it's connected to not the Department of Education, but the Department of Labor. So there's a lot of emphasis on, again, that workplace uh, education and getting jobs and things like that. And programs that get that funding are required to, you know, there's reporting requirements that they show specific literacy gains and they show gains in employment. They're measured based on people getting jobs, people getting higher paying jobs, people getting their GEDs, things like that. Uh, a lot of those state funded programs, you know, that's where their money comes from, that WIOA money. It's matched by the state. And so they're very much tied into those sorts of goals. Our organizations will also, our community-based organizations may get some of that money and may have some parts of their programming that's oriented towards that, but it's much less of a percentage. Might be 20, 25%, and the rest is, yeah, like I said, kind of individual contributions, grants, things like that, that allows them to be able to serve folks with a wider variety of needs. And
So
I think the last time that WIOA was actually officially passed was 2012. It has kind of come up repeatedly, but our government at these days kind of functions on continuing resolutions as opposed to passing new resolutions and budgets. So
sadly.
it's been in need of renewal and updating for a while. hasn't been passed. So we're kind of operating on uh, legislation that's about 10, 12 years old, and funding levels that kind of were set in that legislation and have not really varied that much since then.
So I checked that out, and it's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity
Innovation.
Act.
It used to be it used to be investment, and then it
Yep.
became innovation. Yeah.
Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And real quick before I pass to Joe, are the reporting requirements very cumbersome? Because I think there's very few, as you said, CBOs, community-based organizations, who really can access WIOA funding. So does it tend to go to those larger organizations partially because those reporting requirements are so cumbersome?
The reporting requirements are cumbersome mainly because to report literacy gains, it requires uh, they recognize just a few standardized tests. Those standardized tests are cumbersome to deliver. They're expensive,
Mm-hmm.
and they require kind of a lot of training. So for our community-based organizations, I think they on average have an annual budget of $70,000-$80,000. They may have a couple of part-time staff people, so they don't really have kind of the folks to, the
Right.
money, the resources, and the staffing to kind of invest in that. So they tend to wind up measuring gains very differently, and
Right.
a lot of times it doesn't fit into those reporting standards. So that's really one of the reasons why it's kind of hard. And we've done a lot of advocacy work on trying to get them to recognize alternative ways of measuring literacy progress.
Plus, their focus is really on helping people to read, not necessarily with the end result of funneling them into the workplace, but so they can
Correct.
read to their children, read prescription medicines, take them properly. So, okay.
Yeah. Very, very individualized goal, very specific goal
Right.
oriented.
Joe, can you, again, you've elaborated, alluded to this before, but can you speak more to how adult literacy education is supported in your country? You said you've finally gotten sort of a draft of a policy. So if you want to speak to that a little bit more.
Well, interestingly, Michelle, we're not actually sure if it's a draft of a policy. It's called a framework. So
Oh, okay, a framework. I'm
we're a bit up in
sorry.
the air. Well, we have three tiers of government, I guess, who are involved in this. So we have our federal government, the Commonwealth, and they do fund some really great programs. So we have a really strong adult migrant education program. So every migrant or refugee who arrives in Australia is able to access free language courses, and they're quite substantial. It's hundreds of hours. And the focus is on language, English language and settlement skills. And so literacy and numeracy are obviously part of that. So it's a really great program.
That sounds great.
It's really good, and it's rolled out very well. The teachers who are working on it have postgraduate qualifications in teaching English. So it's a really robust sort of program. Then we have what we call the C program, which stands for Skills for Education and Employment, and it's Commonwealth funded as well, and it's for job seekers.
Okay.
And it's a great program, but lots of reporting, lots of pre-assessment, post-assessment, that sort of thing. It's a bit of a big stick approach that if you want benefits, unemployment benefits, then this might be one of the activities you must do. Therefore, there's reporting on when you do and don't attend, and all of those sorts of things that go with a program like that. And then the Commonwealth have also recently introduced a new program called Foundation Skills for Your Future. And it's to replace, we used to have quite a good program as well, which was a workplace program where you kind of went into a workplace and, help as a literacy teacher, went in and helped people in the workplace. And this is a similar sort of program, but it's quite new. So we're waiting to see some reports on how it's working. And it's in partnership with, so you might have a health organisation who have some staff who need some assistance. And so a training provider can get funds to go in and do some work with those workers. It's just being rolled out now, so it's in the very new stages. But the other thing that the Commonwealth Government here funds, which is not a course, but it's really essential for us in Australia for our literacy landscape, really, is called the Reading Writing Hotline. And it's been around for a long time, I think maybe the 90s, maybe a bit before that. And it's a referral service. So there's advertising on television and what have you, and you ring the phone number, there's a teacher on the other end, and they have a database of all across Australia, literacy classes and services. And so if I rang up and said, I'm in Bogabilla, in the middle of regional area, then they could tell you if there's a class nearby. Now, part of the interesting work with the Reading Writing Hotline is that it's evolved a lot, because what they have found increasingly is that people ring and there's nothing to refer them to. So they've really got this really well-developed website now. They've done a lot of research. They have some assistance for tutors, assistance for workplaces. They have some resources that people might at least be able to touch on, to get started if there's nothing in the area. And they're huge in the advocacy field. We work really closely with them as well. And then we have state governments, and in some places doing an amazing job. They have well-funded neighbourhood centres and community centres, and then in other states and territories is just nothing. So it's just really seems to depend where you live, which is kind of disappointing. And then we have local government, and their role really is around the local community activity, very much as well libraries, because our libraries are funded by your local government. And so in some places there's fabulous volunteer programs running through libraries. In my local council, I wanted to just work one-on-one with a student recently and meet at the library as a sort of neutral space. There wasn't even a table that we could sit at. It all depends on your local council, how well serviced and how well funded the libraries are, and probably on the goodwill of the librarians, because it's not necessarily part of their role to get these volunteer classes going. So what we increasingly find is that Australia is a big place. There's big areas here where there's not many people, and it very much depends where you live as to what kind of service that you can get. If you're in a big city, you've probably got a chance of finding a class or someone to help. The further away you go from a big city, the more you're sort of on your own with no provision. And all three levels of government kind of thinking it's someone else's responsibility. So no resolution, which I guess is why we need some sort of policy that everyone signs off on. So in terms of delivery, I think our main areas, literacy and numeracy for adults, has very much become centred in vocational education and training. So I don't know if you call that the same thing in the States. So we have TAFEs and private training organisations. And so you kind of feel like it's in that space, and government sees it in that space. But then we also have a lot going on in community, neighbourhood houses, community centres. We have volunteer programs, as I said, particularly in libraries. Correctional centres have their literacy programs. Again, each state is funded differently. That's state level. So not a kind of universal thing going on there. One of the gaps I think that we have probably is in industry and business. And we still really have that it's a misunderstanding to me, but industry sees this as the individual's responsibility. So if I'm working for you in your organisation and I've got some literacy gaps and I'm not, reading my work instructions properly, that's my fault. And what we are really trying to do is kind of say workplaces really should be looking at the people that they're employing and adjusting their signage and their processes and their documentation to meet the workforce, not expect the workforce to come up to the level that management are operating on. And so there's this resistance to kind of, why should we dumb down what we're doing? Those people should improve their skills. And so you see this signage and emails and things that are totally inappropriate. And I think that's a huge issue in adult literacy. I don't know if you've managed to tackle that kind of understanding, but it's like an ongoing education program to workplaces and organizations and businesses saying, use plain English.
Yeah.
Look at your
Yeah.
processes, do an audit of what you're making your
Yeah.
workers do. It's not necessary.
Well, you
Yeah.
said several interesting things. Todd, if you don't mind, I would just want to respond
Go
to
ahead.
the read did you say read and write?
Reading, writing hotline.
Reading Writing Hotline. We have something called the National Literacy Directory in this country that was formed with funding from a corporation, Dollar General Literacy Foundation. Dollar General is a corporation that operates dollar stores throughout the country, and they're devoted to literacy because their founder did not complete a high school education and went back later in life to learn to read, and he was very passionate about this, and it's become the company's um focus for their philanthropy. So they have a literacy foundation. They put forward money to start this hotline. ProLiteracy actually partners with an organization called the National Council for Families Learning, another national nonprofit, to run the directory. And it's very similar into what you were saying, that if you were in a very rural area, for instance, here in the States, it might be Montana, Wyoming, it's going to be very hard to find a literacy program to refer you to. So I don't know if this is true of your hotline, but we can also refer volunteers. So people can call, learners can call who need services, whether it's basic English or it's ESL, but also volunteers. But we have the same dilemma with not always having a program everywhere, simply because of the nature of how development works and everything. So same dilemma. You also touched upon something else I wanted to talk about in terms of I can't remember what it was, so I'll go back to the workplace funding and maybe it'll come to me. It's interesting because I feel like we're a little further along in that regard, not by much, but there seems to be at least some companies in this country who have glommed on to this idea that they really need to do something about this literacy issue in their workplace and are doing something about it. And there's one program in Texas that has a program where they actually go into the employer and they run the literacy courses. And we're seeing more of that. I wouldn't say it's the norm, but I think there are pockets where that's further along. What would you say, Todd?
Yeah, I was going to say, and I think the other thing around the kind of business aspect of it is in terms of not just whose responsibility it is, but also helping businesses understand that if you've got an employee that has like 20 years of experience, but they have maybe low literacy levels or low English language levels, they're going to be hesitant to apply for uh, a training job or a managerial job where they're responsible for filling out a lot of paperwork and reading, but moving them, getting them to a point where they feel comfortable moving into that position, your business is going to benefit a lot because they're in a position now where they can mentor the 20 people underneath them and turn them into stellar employees just like they are, and so I think part of that messaging is also that we've kind of tried to help organizations, businesses understand is it really is about you being able to take advantage of the human resources, the human capital in your organization that, they're not, kind of contributing as fully as they want in the business and not able to move up as well. And you're not getting as much out of them, and not in like a greedy bad way, but in like a way that's good for everybody, and so providing those instructional opportunities in the workplace to help them, it really benefits everybody. And as Michelle said, we're starting to have a few organizations that recognize that. The other thing I was going to say, the plain language and just writing in plain language. I think in the US, that would go a long way to, I
Mhm.
think, solving a lot of problems. From our PAC data, we know that about half of our population reads below an 8th grade level. Uh, about 20% read below a 3rd grade level. And I was talking about the domestic violence programs that we were working with in Florida. One of the first things that we did with them is we took areas of their website that provided safety information for survivors who wanted to get away from their abusers. So it's information directly towards their client. And we looked at the reading levels of that information. And it was written at like the 12th, 13th, 14th grade reading level. Like it was high school and college level stuff. And when we kind of took that and juxtaposed it with half the population of your community reads below an 8th grade level, they can't read this. You know, it was real eye opening to them, just in terms of we really need to go back and look at all of our communications, all of the information that we put out, and really make it simpler and more accessible to people. And when they started to do that, they saw like great benefit in how better they were able to serve people. And I
Actually,
think that'll be
That's
true for businesses and
yeah,
really a lot of folks.
and going back
that's
to
the sort of
business,
advocacy. Sorry,
no,
that's
that's
the
go
sort
ahead.
of advocacy work we've been doing too around, you know, kind of trying to educate people to say this is the reading level 43% in Australia in the last PAC. You know, didn't have the skills to read that everyday
Yeah.
information. So, you know, if you want to reach almost half the population, you have to
Right.
Yeah.
adjust what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's hard to ignore the economics though here too, because really, if businesses increasingly, certainly in this country, college education is the goal, that's the ticket to, a sustaining employment. These may be the only individuals you can get to fill these positions, in which case you have to maximize that investment in labor. I mean, let's be honest, most companies are not, they're not in business for the good of the community. So there has to be some sort of sometimes an economic force to drive them, and really, increasingly individuals who can read, they're not going to want to do these jobs part-time or whatnot. So these may be the labor pool you can pull from, and so it makes sense to develop them within your company. And it also reminded me the question I wanted to ask you, which is, it's not germane to our questions, but I am interested. You mentioned immigrant populations, and I'm curious about where Australia's immigrant populations are coming from versus sort of what the US patterns are. Can you speak to that real briefly? Because again, it's just sort of a interesting side point.
I think we've got a fairly broad range. And so we've got migrants coming in and work, well, all paused for COVID, but I think getting back on
Mhm.
track now. A lot of educated migrants coming into on work visas and to fill work skills shortages. And then we have a refugee population, probably from all the same kinds of areas that you have, although I imagine Australia's is probably on a smaller scale. But because of the geographic distance,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
but a representative, I would say, across. And so we have people coming in who are quite skilled, through to people who are not literate in their own language
Mhm.
as well. And the program can cater for all of those people.
Great. Todd, what would you say in the US?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, we get kind of a wide range of immigrant population and wide range of education levels as well. Kind of recently, as I said, we've gotten a lot of immigration from Afghanistan, from the Middle East, from mostly because of the wars in the Middle East that we've been involved in, and Ukraine. We get a large migrant population coming up from Central and South America. Um, they can be very educated or not very literate in their native language. A lot of those folks wind up being migrant farm workers and folks like that. And so kind of serving that population is difficult because they're migratory, they go where the work is. So they may tend to wind up in library programs because there tends to be libraries in whatever community that they're in. And so a lot of the work we do around those folks is maybe sometimes helping them become literate in their native language in Spanish before trying to learn English, just because it's easier for them to transfer those kind of skills. Once it's easier for them to recognize the connection between spoken language and written language in their native language. And then once they understand that relationship, it's then easier to learn English.
And before you move on to the next question, I just want to share one more thing with you, Joe. It reminded me, we have something called the American Library Association in this country, and it's called the ALA. And they actually have a, I don't know if you'd call it a subdivision that is dedicated to literacy. And Todd mentioned working with literacy, the library programs. At one point, they developed this whole, I don't know what you call it, package of
Action
information,
plan.
action plan, and then supporting information to help libraries, if not house literacy programs, to support literacy programs in their libraries. And a lot of our literacy programs are increasingly housed in libraries, even though they're a separate nonprofit, they're incorporated as their own nonprofit. Many of them will have their offices in libraries and find that they get space from those libraries. So it's just something interesting. So we're talking about libraries. I'd say there's a pretty big commitment to that. But having said that, we have plenty of libraries that have no literacy person there or don't have a support person, but certainly there's a widespread effort, and there are many, many libraries that do have that. So I just wanted to share that because I thought that was an interesting point. We're getting short on time, and I really want to cover these last few questions because they're very interesting. I think this next one we could address fairly quickly. What training, I'm going to give this to you, Joe, first. What training or qualifications does a person need to be considered a specialist or professional? So I guess this speaks to the practitioners of adult literacy in your country, what those levels are and what the requirements are.
Well, this is actually quite a tricky question for us.
Oh.
So if you're if you're an English
Okay.
language teacher, postgraduate, to work on that AMEP program, the Migrant Education Program. But in the adult literacy and numeracy space, it's really a murky area at the moment. And that's because we used to have quite a robust education system there. It was a real professional pathway, bachelor's in adult literacy and numeracy through postgraduate, masters and what have you. And I'm in my mid-50s, and I'm probably the younger of the group of people who have that level of qualification quite robustly. What happened here was that we went into a training market that was competitive, and so a lot of the work moved out of the government-funded TAFEs and vocational education sector into private training organisations, who then had a lot of power and didn't want to have to pay or find people who were qualified. And at the same time, that coincided with a big program that was kind of around international literacy, or I guess in the 1990s, about literacy is everyone's business. So suddenly it kind of became, we don't want to have to employ people who are specialists. And so the national training package now requires just a certificate for, not even in literacy and numeracy, just in training and assessment. And so because there's no demand for people to have a higher qualification, there's very few universities that are offering something that is on adult literacy and numeracy. People are coming to us all the time saying, how do I get a career in this? What's the qualification? And it's really hard to answer, because I think Australia has done a very poor job in future-proofing the skills in this area. And we're going to have generations of people coming through who know bits about this and bits about that, but without a really robust theoretical education backing them up.
Where would they get the certificate that they do ask for? Where would an individual secure that certificate? From a university?
That's no, from a TAFE. Yeah.
Okay.
And standards, I have to say, standards vary. You can do a very robust one, or you could do a very quick short one.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Todd, do you think you could speak to kind of the different practitioners and what the requirements are in the US?
Sure. So again, I kind of talked about those state-funded or federal and state-funded adult education programs. Those tend to be professional teachers, full-time or part-time professional teachers. The full-time generally will have degrees in adult education. There's a few colleges, universities that have a bachelor's, master's in adult education, but it's not widespread. Um, the Typically the part-time, the other teachers that are working in those uh, programs might have a degree in education, not necessarily adult, but they might be high school education, sometimes elementary school education. Those programs vary from state to state, but they're required to have yearly amount of professional development credits. So they will attend continued professional training and development conferences, things like that, to kind of keep up on the latest research and techniques and maintain those credits. And so that's really that state funded area. Um, a lot of the teachers that work in the correctional facilities, same sort of education background. In the libraries and in the community-based organizations, most of that instruction tends to be delivered by volunteers. Those volunteers will typically go through an extensive training before they go into service, and then the programs will provide additional training as they go through in terms of a lot of times it's webinars provided by ProLiteracy. We also provide a lot of training materials for that pre-service training. But again, they'll attend conferences and things like that. And just in terms of like actual impact, we find that the programs that use volunteers have fundamentally the same kind of educational gains as the programs that use professional teachers. And I think because a lot of that is because really what we know, like we know how to educate people, we know how to teach them to read. It's for the vast majority of the population, it's not overly complicated. It just takes time and dedication and resources and attention and uh, you know, somebody to provide information to them because they can't figure it out on their own. For those folks that have, you know, more complicated situations, learning disabilities and things like that, that's really where kind of the professional interventions are needed. Did that?
Yeah, and I would say just to add to the tutors at these community-based programs, Joe, tend to be, let's say, very mature, and a lot of them, I'm talking sometimes in their 70s and 80s, and a lot of them they were former teachers at the K through
Mhm.
12 level, and they loved teaching and they loved education, so they want to get back. That's not always the case. You could have an individual comes in with no teaching background who discovers this challenge of adult literacy and wants to help. And then the training those tutors get really varies by program to program. There's no national standard. So each program sort of determines what kind of do they want to have an in-service for before they send them out and match them with somebody. How many hours is that? What kind of training after that do they want to have? How many in-services? It varies by program to program and is sort of based on what they think their individual tutors might give or could handle, as well as just their needs. So just to kind of expand on that picture.
Yeah.
I think our volunteer workforce sounds very similar and a
Yeah.
similar approach. It depends
Yeah.
who's running the course as to what training they get.
Yep.
Yeah.
But good tip, if you want to live a long life, get involved in adult literacy, because I've spoken to some of these individuals on the phone and it's really funny because they're like, well, I'm in my 80s now, so I have to start slowing down a little. And it's just, and our founder or co-founder, Ruth Colvin, who founded Literacy Volunteers of America, which merged with Lobach Literacy to form ProLiteracy, is 105. She just turned 105. So spread the word. If you want to live a long life, that
And
could be a new volunteer recruitment campaign to get tutors. You want to live longer? Get involved in adult
yeah.
literacy. Okay, so real quick, we got two more questions. Uh, Joe, I'm going to give this one to you first. What is the emphasis of your work right now? And what do you know about the needs in the community right now in terms of digital literacy, workforce development? Take it away.
Yeah, I think COVID really, I mean, we knew there was issues with digital literacy, of course, and access as well.
Mhm.
You know, I was living in a more regional area to where I am now, and you know, I had some staff who had to kind of walk for a couple of Ks to be able to ring me on their phone. So, you know, it's a big country and services vary. So digital literacy is even not always just about your skills, but about whether you can even get online and get any any connectivity.
Mhm.
So digital literacy is big here, but there's a big push, and everyone's got on board with digital literacy, I think. Particularly after COVID. So it's probably got the most exposure of any types of literacy you might want to say at the moment. I think for us, our big emphasis is really still on that broad awareness and breaking down the myths and the stereotypes around this, and saying that this isn't just a migrant and refugee issue, that there's a lot of people who were born in Australia and who have literacy issues, and it can be around the way that texts are written, and that, you know, if we used plain language and what have you, it might be addressed. So we've been involved in a television show, as I said. It's a documentary called Lost for Words, and it screened last year, and series 2 is in production at the moment. And it followed 8 adult learners who came into a class. Myself and another teacher taught them. And it looked at their backstories and, you know, showed their lives. And I think it was a really great public awareness raising activity, because they were working, they were young. Most of them had hidden the fact. Some of them had, even their husband didn't know that they were having this much, facing these many barriers with literacy. So it's been a really powerful way to reach the general public. And what we found from that is that people are really interested. And when they hear the statistics and see the stories, then that's a really powerful way to get that message out and to get people interested. So we did get quite overwhelmed by people wanting to volunteer to come into the field, or coming to us and saying, oh, I want a job like yours. How do I get that? And then calls to the reading writing hotline increased during the screening of the show, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done around reaching the actual people who could benefit from some sort of class or assistance, and to break down those barriers of feeling embarrassed and the stigma around it. So I think really for me personally, that's the main area that I've been focusing on. And a lot of things have come out of that, like organisations have come to us and said, oh, can you tell us about literacy and what we should do in our organisation, you know, to address this? And, you know, I've talked to people in health literacy and in legal and in government. And so it's given us a kind of opportunity to talk to people more about this, and for them to see what they can do from their perspective, which has been really good. So I think that's kind of a big focus for us at the moment. And everything else is just all those ongoing things that we've talked about. You know, we need provision, we need opportunities.
Right. The national commitment.
Yes.
Todd, what would you say is the emphasis in the US right now?
Yeah, so I would say kind of the same thing. So, you know, in addition to the work that we kind of do and kind of view as our core work, you know, the pandemic revealed a big need for digital literacy work. And so our local programs are starting to incorporate that into the work that they do. And so it's really for us kind of looking at how we can support that with materials and training. I think another emphasis that we have is really on helping programs. When the pandemic hit, they had to transition to kind of a virtual environment in about 3 weeks. One of the things that came out of that was programs realized that they were that doing that was not necessarily a bad thing. They were able to get some students to come back into their programs that had left because of transportation issues, childcare issues, varied schedules. Um, they were able to reach folks in communities because geography was no longer a barrier. And so now they are, as we're kind of coming back and meeting in person, a lot of those programs are continuing those virtual services as well. So we're doing a lot of training and developing resources around that to help programs kind of take things that they kind of put in place, maybe piecemeal, and looking at how to flesh them out and support them. And so that's another kind of real emphasis of our work. And Michelle, I'll go ahead and kind of talk about what the future holds,
Sure.
because I think this is a good transition into
Yep.
that. I know that's your next question. So I think one of the things that we recognized in the pandemic is a need for a lot more digital resources that were easy for people to use online in a Zoom environment, and just, resources that people could, pick up their phone and, it would help them learn to read, learn math, learn some digital literacy skills. And so during the pandemic, a lot of kind of education resource developers, and right before that, uh, had started to develop a lot of these resources, but during the pandemic, they really started to use them more. So I think one of the things that the future holds is really kind of seeing much more of a blending of the use of apps and online instruction with face-to-face instruction, and really being able, Joe, as you were talking about, really being able to reach people that are out in kind of rural areas where they may not have a literacy program nearby that you can refer them to, but you may be able to get them onto an app or onto an online program. And I think in that way, the future is really bright in our ability to reach folks that normally wouldn't be served, and to be able, I think those kind of digital platforms also provide us with a way to partner with those other kind of social service agencies to reach adults that we know have English language or literacy issues, but they may not be in an adult education program. But maybe they're in a domestic violence shelter, or maybe they're in a transitional housing program, or maybe they're doing something else, and being able to partner with those organizations to provide literacy services there, because we know those organizations don't have the ability to launch a full-fledged adult literacy program, but if they have resources that are easy for their clients to utilize, that's a good way to connect for them. So I think there's a lot of, that those kind of digital provision with a little bit of support from a library or a local program or a volunteer, um, provide us with an opportunity to really reach a lot more people. And then the other thing I'll say is uh, the Barbara Bush Foundation. Barbara Bush, our former First Lady, literacy was a really important issue for her. And the Barbara Bush Foundation, that's been involved in literacy for a long time, launched a national uh, adult literacy project called the National Action Plan, where they have brought together ProLiteracy and a lot of the other adult education providers to kind of initiate this large nationwide plan on advocacy to increase funding, to develop more services and things like that. So I think Dollar General has been a big funder of that plan, at least initially. So uh, we're hoping that that is going to bring a lot more awareness about the issue in general. It's going to motivate and mobilize students to enroll, people to get involved as volunteers, businesses to contribute, those sorts of things. So kind of in terms of the future, we hope the future looks bright because of that initiative and bringing together all the adult education organizations around this one initiative. So
What do you think, Joe?
Oh, I'm really interested, in the philanthropic um, interest that you seem to have in the field. I think that is very much missing in Australia. Actually, I can't think of any big organisations or individuals really who are taking this on as an issue. So that's really interesting and something that I think we could think more about actually. Well, we've just interestingly had, I've gone through this whole interview without even saying, we just had a national parliamentary inquiry into the importance of adult literacy. I suppose I haven't mentioned it because all this effort went into it, and then it seems that nothing has happened. But I feel that we're in a bit of a transition at the moment because we've just had a new government elected after many years, and they really seem to have a focus on social issues and equity. So I think we're all very hopeful, that we'll see things moving forward, that maybe we'll get some more understanding that literacy is not just something, that will drive the economic outcomes of the country, but it's important for everybody's day-to-day lives and, the life satisfaction, your mental health. And, there's flow-on effects to everything every time that you improve someone's literacy. And so I think there's opportunities here for us to have like some really good outcomes and for things to kind of move forward. I see a lot of interest at the moment, which is really nice, in trauma-informed teaching. I think there's a slight misunderstanding that I saw in that parliamentary inquiry that solving literacy in schools will solve adult literacy issues, and I don't think there's a kind of direct there's some sort of missing information there that people don't just learn because they're not listening at school or not being taught in the right way, but all these other things can happen.
Right,
There's many reasons why people, have literacy gaps. So I think all of that is just ongoing understanding, and it is nice to see this conversation happening. So I think the more that we can talk about this and hear different views and different perspectives, the more that will happen in the future. And we have a lot of things sitting in draft. So perhaps if we talk again in 12 months, perhaps I'll have all these fabulous policies and frameworks and everything that are underway and established and funded.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Todd? Anything you want to add to that?
No. I think it is an exciting time. It sounds like with a government that's focused on social issues, and I think we and you both understand that kind of at that foundational level, like improving people's literacy skills and language skills and math skills and digital literacy skills is really a building block to addressing all of those other social issues. And I mean, I just think about, it again, kind of our governments tend to focus on, employment and those sorts of things. But I just think about how much more enjoyable my life is when, I'm riding in an Uber with someone who, is interesting to talk to and, feels confident in their language abilities and things like that. Like, just your community is better when people are when education is not a barrier, but it is a foundation on which they can kind of achieve all the things that they want to achieve. And it just makes everybody happier and a better community.
That almost sounds like an advertisement to itself. Tagline.
Yeah.
Any last words, Joe?
I just really appreciate this conversation. I think it's been really interesting, and it is you're right, Todd. It's lovely to see the same sort of motivation. For me, I think it's just all about, trying to make things a little bit more even and equal for everyone. And people might not want to read a book, but they need to have the choice to do that.
Absolutely.
They might not want to pick up that magazine or fill in that form, but they need to have the choice. And I think that's what it's all about.
Well, I just
and they may want to read War and Peace, or they may want to read a trashy novel.
That's right.
And both are equally valid, right?
Well, I want to thank you both, Joe and Todd. This has been a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. And I have to say, I really felt like there were more similarities than dissimilarities. I see a lot of
Agreed.
overlap. It was very interesting. We'll be sharing this discussion with the adult literacy field, and I hope anyone who listens really gains something from it and enjoys it. And I want to thank you both again for sharing your knowledge and insights. Please have a great day.
Thank you. It
Thank
was a
you. Thank
pleasure.
Michelle. Thanks, Joe.
Bye.